I just want to welcome everybody today. We're going to talk today about the results of our public and charity surveys that we do every couple of years. And we did them way back before COVID was a real thing. But because of COVID and our surveys we did for that, we've only just released the findings. They're very interesting and we want to make sure we're sharing them as widely as possible. And so after the session, they'll also be up online for other people to look at the presentation and to understand a little bit of what that tells us about the sector and so on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass over to my colleague Louise, who is doing all the heavy lifting on this. I will maybe jump in from time to time, but she's going to do a bit of a presentation on the surveys, and there will be a chance to participate at the end of that. Louise, over to you.
Hello there. Thanks, Jude, and thank you all for coming along to hear a bit about some of the results from our public and charity surveys. Now, as Jude mentioned, this event is slightly unusual for us. Normally, this might be the sort of session that we would have maybe internally for OSCR staff or board members and so on. And we realised that this sort of webinar is probably not the same as some of our others on sort of practical help and advice for charities. But we are really, really delighted that you are interested enough in this topic to hear more about trust. And there will be an opportunity to sort of ask some questions and discuss some of the results at the end. But as Jude said, because it's quite a select but perfectly formed group, I'm very happy to discuss particular aspects of the results during the presentation too. So Jude and some of my colleagues who are here today will keep an eye on the chat. But before we get started, Cameron, are the slides showing? Have we got slides? So if we just move on, before we get started properly, I'd just like to outline what we're going to cover during this session. So if we move to the first slide there. Yeah, we're going to discuss the surveys, why we're doing them now, why we've done them. And we're going to look at why trust matters. We're also going to cover a little bit about how regulation can help and how it is helping. And also we're going to look a little bit about building our knowledge, how we can use this information to build our knowledge. What do these results mean for charities and for OSCR? And at the end, there will be the opportunity to ask some questions and have a little bit of discussion. So moving on to the first of these areas, why now? Why do we do this research? Well, this slide shows our current vision and purpose from OSCR's new corporate plan. So this is for the period 2020 to 2023, and it was published at the end of August. So our vision is for a trusted and respected sector which positively contributes to society. And our purpose is to hold charities to account and to help the sector improve so the public have trust and confidence in charities. So the research that we carry out, our public and charity surveys, it not only helps us actually get a measure of trust by measuring trust and confidence in charities, but it helps us figure out what drives trust and how we can deliver our work with charities to provide reassurance to the public. And so moving on, so although this is something that's been at the core of what we do for some time, there are some challenges of measuring public trust for Scottish charities. The sector in Scotland, as many of you will be more than aware of, the sector is really, really diverse in Scotland. And I think that's actually the true strength of the sector in Scotland, that it's not just a certain segment, it's the entire remit from big names all the way down to community groups. And so it's a challenge to try and find out and to try and ask the public what their opinion is across such a diverse sector. And it can be even more challenging when you think about how we could regulate these organisations to provide reassurance and trust. So on to the next slide. That's not the only challenge. The operating environment for charities is constantly changing, and that is never truer than it is at the moment. Even before March this year, when we were carrying out our fieldwork for the research, lots of things were affecting the landscape. So there's the economy has been changing, relationships with funders, over the years, reliance on donations and the need for diversification of activities and of funding streams. There's also press and public scrutiny. And now, on the top of that, we have a global pandemic. But sort of more fundamentally, the way that charities work and what they do is also changing. The modern charity and what it does is actually sometimes very different from what had previously been. Sometimes the public have quite a historical view of charities and good causes. And the way people see charities, donate and see good causes is shaped by lots of things out there, shaped by people's friends and families, their social media feeds, what's in the press, and so on. And so in the eyes of the public, we wanted to know, what is a trustworthy charity? And how should a charity or a regulator evidence that? What should they do? And we also wanted to find out what our role was in that. How is regulation perceived? And what is it that the public need to know? And so that brings us onto our research, which, as Jude said, was carried out at the start of this year before the full extent of the pandemic was really known. So our fieldwork was carried out between February and March 2020. Now, we carry out for this research two large-scale quantitative surveys. One samples the general public and one samples charities, with just over 1,000 in each group. And we also carry out some qualitative research. So there are public focus groups in Aberdeen and Glasgow, and we also carry out in-depth telephone conversations with charities. And while the surveys provide figures, that qualitative work really helps us to understand the context and the motivations for why a particular response might be given, so we can really understand what the findings mean. But at the start of this year, when we were planning the research and looking at the materials and the questions, we realised we've been carrying out this research in a fairly similar format since around 2014. And for some areas of the research, for some parts of it, we'd been carrying it out in that format for even longer than that. So we decided on some changes. We wanted to be able to rely on a really robust set of results that we could use in lots of different ways. So we worked with our supplier, Breaking Glue, to overhaul the materials. What we wanted to do was focus more on the nature and impact of trust in a way that was relatable to the people answering the survey. So instead of asking about an abstract concept of trust, we asked about trustworthiness and thinking about charities that they knew and they were familiar with. And so although we've retained some comparisons to the previous years, we have fewer of those this time, as many of the questions were different. So what did we find? Well, the first thing to say is that Scottish charities are very well supported by the general public. 93% of Scottish adults have given money, time, or goods in the last year. And when we asked those people what their top 3 reasons for donating were, the most common answer was that the cause was important. It was a cause that they really felt was important, followed by the fact that the charity can be trusted. And other common answers were that their beliefs were matched their beliefs, and that there was a personal connection with the charity. But from those results, we know that trust does matter. And so moving on, that's really helpful for us, and it's really helpful for charities themselves. Can we just move to the next slide? That's great. So the very worthy headline from the results overall is that trust and confidence increased in 2020 from a mean score of 6.14 out of 10 in 2018 to 7.02 out of 10 in 2020. And if we move to the next slide, one of the interesting things that we found when we were looking at that overall increase in trust is that an increase was also measured in England and Wales by the Charity Commission. So this slide shows the mean trust scores out of 10 across a number of years. Now in England and Wales, which is shown on this chart with the CCEW line, the actual values have been lower, as they have been for a number of years, but the overall trend was mirrored. And that was interesting for us because they carry out their research at a similar time to us and actually in quite a similar way to us. And I also wanted to show on this chart that we're not the only people that measure trust. Lots of charity sector research organisations and others also measure trust in charities. So the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations have measured trust and confidence in the past before. And it's really helpful to see how those figures compare in the Scottish context. So when SCVO did their research, at that time the findings were very broadly similar, despite the research being conducted in a different way and at a different point in the year. And so if we move on to the next slide, this session, Paula has billed it as a deep dive. So holding on and looking at this increase for a little longer, we now have detailed data to show how people scored trust, what they gave the individual scores from 0 to 10 in 2020. And in the previous years, shown in grey on this chart, 2014, 2016 and 2018. And what we can see in grey is that the mid-range peaks of around 5 and 6 were higher in previous years, but this year we can see those figures are lower and those mid-range scores are now peaking at 7 or 8. So we can see the curve for the mean value of trust is subtly moved upwards. What we can also see is that the scores round about 9 and 10 are about the same. And the scores lower down are lower this year, but sort of broadly similar. So this shift has been subtly in the mid-range of the scores. It has not been at the extreme ends of the range. And so it's not the Scottish public awarding Scottish charities 10 out of 10 quite yet, but we may get there. But what else is behind those scores? Oh, sorry, there's a little bit. So moving on, what else is behind those scores? Well, we know now that the female score for trust in charities is statistically significantly higher than in males, and that's something that we've seen in previous years. And what we also have this time is a small but not a statistically significant trend of decreasing trust with age. Now, we've seen this in the past, and in the past it has been more of a statistically significant trend, but this year that didn't come out quite as strongly. But I think it is something that would be really interesting to unpack in a little bit more detail, and thinking about the way that different groups or different segments of the public access information and engage with charities, and maybe even thinking about the way that technology is used to raise funds and seek donations for good causes. So I'm going to move on slightly and talk a little bit about timing and external factors. So as well as asking about overall trust and confidence, we asked the public whether charities were more or less trustworthy than 2 years ago. And we can see from this slide that there has been a large increase in the figures from 2018. We now have 68% feeling that charities are just as trustworthy or more trustworthy than 2 years ago. And there is a decreased proportion saying that charities are less trustworthy than 2 years ago. So that's gone down from 44% in 2018 to 29% this time. And when we asked about the reasons for this, which are on the next slide, when we asked about the reasons for this, they revolve around awareness of scandals or negative media stories. While when we asked about the reasons for increased trust on the right of this slide, the answers mention the sort of information that's available, better transparency and positive media support. And this is when timing becomes really interesting. Last time, the surveys were conducted around the time in 2018 where there was a safeguarding scandal in the news. Now, lots of charities were affected, but Oxfam is maybe the one you might remember the most from the news reports. And in 2016, the time before, when we did the research, there had been a lot in the news following the collapse of Kids Company. So this year we have the increase in trust, and it's maybe not surprising that a little distance from those stories in the news has created an uplift in the trust scores. But if you look at the report, our researchers also identified that over the last 2 years, as well as maybe slightly less negative news coverage from charities, there has been little room in the news for anything other than Brexit. And really around the time this research fieldwork was being carried out, COVID-19 as well. So it just shows the impact of that external influence. However, that is not the only thing that can affect people's perception of trustworthiness and overall trust scores. Over a number of years, we've measured the trust scores for a number of different types of charity and sort of where they operate. And we asked that again this year, albeit with slightly different wording. So what we've asked in previous years is not just trust about overall trust in charities as a sector overall, but how much people trust local charities, charities that work in Scotland, charities that work across the UK, and charities that work on an international basis. So what we found interesting when we first started asking this in 2014 is that there was quite a clear trend of decreasing trust with increasing geographic scale. And we asked that again this year, and we have a similar trend, albeit, as I said, the wording was slightly different. And what we took this to mean was that it seems to indicate that a close connection to a charity's work is quite important. But this was one of the areas where we really wanted to improve how robust the research was. And so looking at scale, we thought we're really not very sure that that's the only factor at play here. We didn't think our questioning was robust enough to really untangle some of the assumptions that people might be making about these charities. So if we move on to the next slide, we looked at a much larger range of types of charity to try and sort of disentangle some of the assumptions people might make. And so, for example, even when we were discussing research, were we making the assumption that local charities were small and that international charities were large? And when that's really not always the case. So when we did that and asked about trust for a whole range of different charities, we found that while smaller charities, they're in blue with 6.49, while smaller charities were more trusted than larger ones, size really had less of an influence than the geographic scale had. But we found other things as well. Lower scores were found, for example, for charities who fundraise in the street, while higher scores were also found for those with charities with volunteers. So that maybe underlines that sort of long-held historical view of what a charity is, or what people think maybe a charity should be. So moving on, how does regulation help with that? Well, when we look at the trust scores and we sort of use the cross breaks from the data tables to analyse the public's response in a little bit more detail again, we know that we can get higher trust scores. Higher trust scores are given by those who have contact with or some involvement with a charity, and those that know something about OSCR. So you can see those that have had contact with a charity, either as a service user, volunteer, trustee, or so on, 7.2, and no contact, it's lower at 6.94. And when we ask about what inspires trust on the next slide, we find that unprompted, with an open question, that transparency is really vital, which is really good because it's something we're really passionate about. And in the research, from open answers people have given, we find this takes two forms. So when they're talking about transparency and talking about what that means to them, there's direct transparency, which we've seen as seeing a positive impact with donations, seeing what the charity is doing, saying, I've given a donation to this charity, I can see the work they're doing, I can see the good in it, I know how that money is being used. But there's also another side to that, which is a side that OSCR is particularly involved in, which is the administrative accountability side of things. So a different sort of transparency, sort of being open with accounts, being open with governance and with processes about making information available for people to check or to look at. But if we move on to the next slide, even when people are prompted, we find that being transparent about how donations are used and seeing evidence of what is achieved come out top of the list. So this is a slide which is, the chart in particular is one of my favourites that comes out of this research each time we do it. So we ask what's most likely to increase trustworthiness and provided a range of options. So knowing how much of a donation goes to the cause, seeing evidence of what is achieved are usually very near the top of the list. But further down the list, we also see that having open access to accounts is there and knowing a charity is well run. And right in the middle, you can see that knowing a charity is independently regulated also increases trustworthiness. So knowing that a charity is independently regulated, knowing how that role contributes to trustworthiness is an interesting thing to think about. So if we move along again, if we're thinking about knowing a charity is independently regulated, this research we also use to find out a little bit about what the public know about OSCR and about charity regulation. And what we found was that in general, there is quite a low level of awareness about OSCR, with 1 in 4, about a quarter, knowing OSCR, and about 14% knowing a little bit more about what we do. So this was a little bit lower than we've had in previous years, but again, we did overhaul the questionnaire to try and make it really robust. Moving on to the next slide, although there's a low level awareness about OSCR specifically, there is an assumption that there is some sort of charity regulation in Scotland. So when we prompted the general public with a range of scenarios about charity regulation, from, for example, there is no regulation in the sector whatsoever, through to sort of self-regulation, or there being a part of the Scottish Government that does this, or there being a Scottish public body regulating charities, 53% say there is some sort of regulation, and only 3% say there is none. And it's probably important to acknowledge that quite a large proportion don't really know very much about the nature of regulation in Scotland. And if we move on again, while specific awareness about OSCR is low, when we prompt people and explain a little bit about who we are, what we do, what our role is, what our functions are, 92% of the public say that is important, with 68% saying it's a very important role. So regulation is, there is an appetite for regulation in Scotland to do the job that OSCR is doing. So if we move on again, we've spoken quite a lot during this session so far about public trust, but what I've not really brought into the discussion yet is the charity side of the research. And that is really, really important, because as we've seen, many of the factors that are able to inspire trust and trustworthiness and demonstrate that to the public are things that charities are doing themselves, not sometimes via OSCR as a proxy. So what this slide is showing is which of OSCR's functions charities and the public think are most important for maintaining, protecting and enhancing trustworthiness in Scottish charities. So we can see that the top 3 on both sides, the public side and the charity side, are ensuring charities stay within the law, checking or monitoring charities' accounts, and keeping a register of charities. And it's similar for both see those as the top 3. But we can also see that there's a greater emphasis on checking and monitoring charity accounts for charities than there is for the public. And it's also interesting that further down there, 1, 2, 3, 5 down there, that the role of handling complaints, the public value this more than charities value it, but it still comes above some of the other things that OSCR is involved in, such as working to improve confidence in the sector, training and improving the image of the sector. in terms of what is important in trustworthiness. So this gives us a snapshot of where the charities view and the public view differs slightly. So moving on again, an interesting sort of new area that we investigated this time was a series of questions on the locus or the balance of responsibility. So the reason we wanted to look at this was sort of building on some of the findings we've had from focus group sessions in previous years and from other academic research, specifically from Carolyn Cordery, who is a professor and expert in the accountability of non-profit organisations at Aston University in Birmingham. Now, our market research is not in any way the same standard as academic research, but we know that members of the public often go directly to charities for information. And knowing that awareness of OSCR is low, we wanted to find out how charities saw that balance of responsibility in a number of areas. So what we asked was, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is entirely the responsibility of individual charities, and 5 is entirely the responsibility, how responsible, where do charities view the responsibility for a number of these areas? And some of the results were pretty surprising. What was clear was that in each case, a decent proportion of charities saw that it was a balance and scored it sort of 3 out of 5 or neutral, which is very understandable. But still, what is interesting are those where charities have the expectation that they are perhaps less responsible than OSCR for a particular area. So for example, if we look at number 2 there, which is ensuring that the public has access to charities' annual reports and accounts, we can see that 45% see this mainly as OSCR's responsibility, and just 14% the responsibility of individual charities. And it's very similar for a similar area. So looking at number 5 there, the top on the right-hand side, which is ensuring that charities are transparent and accountable, we can see that 40% see this as mainly OSCR's responsibility and 16% responsibility of individual charities. But there were differences between some of these areas. If we look at ensuring charities were well run, which is number 3, a higher proportion said that that was down to individual charities at 36%, but it was definitely more of a split. And finally, looking at number 6 there, particularly crucial for OSCR, ensuring charities operate within the law, again, more charities found this was mainly or entirely down to OSCR. They felt it was our responsibility at 42%. So what we've done is we've looked at some of these areas in a little bit more detail to try and understand why that might be. So if we move to the next slide, so we looked at a cross-section of characteristics, and there was one area that stood out as having significant differences between groups that sort of might be helpful in understanding the results a little bit more. So I've recharted the figures to show the scores from entirely charities' responsibility in the darker colours on the left-hand side, all the way to entirely OSCR's responsibility in the lighter shades on the right-hand side. And I've also charted the don't knows, which there were not a lot of, considering it's maybe quite a complex question to get a handle on. And what we found when we looked at that first example that I mentioned on the previous slide, ensuring that the public has access to charities' annual reports and accounts, we found that smaller charities are significantly more likely to see this as entirely OSCR's responsibility. So if we look at the left-hand chart, for smaller charities with incomes up to £25,000, we can see that more smaller charities view this as OSCR's responsibility, and that a significantly higher proportion of larger charities see this as a joint effort, which is the sort of medium shade circle with 44% for the larger charities in the chart on the left. And you can see, just browsing the sort of more detailed breakdown of income on the right hand side, you can see that trend sort of replicated with the diagonal line between the, if you put an imaginary diagonal line between some of the bars on the chart. And if we move on to the next example, it was very similar. So ensuring charities access to annual reports and accounts, very similar trend to ensures that charities are transparent and accountable. So although the terminology is different, people are, it's reinforced because we get very similar results. Smaller charities are significantly more likely to see this as entirely OSCR's responsibility, and a significantly higher proportion of larger charities see this as a joint effort. And moving on to the next example, ensuring that charities are well run. This was the area where overall charities felt it was more their responsibility, the responsibility of individual charities. And we find that that's sitting mainly with larger charities. They're the ones that are statistically significantly more likely to see this as their responsibility. And moving on to the final area, ensuring charities operate within the law, what we found is that smaller charities are significantly more likely to see this as entirely OSCR's responsibility. And actually, using the chart on the right, statistically, all income groups up to 100k are significantly more likely to say this is OSCR's responsibility. And it's those larger organisations that have a smaller proportion saying it's OSCR's responsibility. So what does this mean for OSCR and for charities, and how can we use those results to build our knowledge? So the findings have taken us a little bit further forward in our thinking about what we think practically might help us build trust and confidence in charities. But what they've done is really help us think about OSCR's role in that. As public awareness of OSCR, quite specifically, is low, is raising awareness of OSCR part of the answer? If OSCR had a higher profile, would more people use the register to seek information about Scottish charities? Or maybe people don't need to know about OSCR specifically, maybe they just need to know more about some of the things we do, such as the register and about the Scottish Charity number. And that's something that came out really quite strongly in some of our focus groups. But our relationship with charities is crucial. Should there be more emphasis on some of the actions that charities can take? The balance of responsibility for driving up trust and confidence. Should we focus more on the Scottish Charity number and how recognisable it is to members of the public? And should we focus more on charities providing or making available copies of their annual reports and accounts, providing that sort of willing accountability and transparency as opposed to sort of being enforced by a regulator? But the research also shows that knowing how much of a donation goes to the cause and seeing what the charity has achieved are both more likely to increase trustworthiness than having open access to its accounts and knowing it's well run. So on the next slide, when we talk about these things, usually we mention the balance of responsibility. And so what we have already available in our materials is the charity registration logo, which charities can access and add to their website. But you can also provide a link to your annual reports and accounts if you publish them yourself, and we will include that on the register so that others can see it. So even if you're not one of the charities that OSCR publishes accounts for, you can get that information out there through the register entry. And there's also the importance of telling your charity's story. As we said, showing evidence of what's achieved and how much of a donation goes to a cause is really important. And there's different ways that you can do that through your trustee's annual report, which you can also publicise in other ways on your website or through social media. But finally, on the last slide, thanks, really understanding charities and the issues they're facing is really crucial to building part of the story. What we need to do is understand charities, the issues they're facing, so that we can target support and guidance where it's needed What we would like to do is use the knowledge from sets of results like this, from the register, from the information that we hold, to improve knowledge and awareness of the sector and of its regulation. We think that if we do that, that we'll be able to generate a much clearer public understanding of charities so that the public can engage with confidence. But just one final observation about where we might go next, and I think it's on the conundrum around this balance of responsibility and the locus of responsibility. It's really interesting to think about that in terms of shaping our role and what we should do as priorities. So from this research, we know what charities think. Maybe the next interesting step for us would be to know in more detail what the public think about these details. And so that was our quick run through of the Scottish Charity and Public Surveys. Thank you for staying with us. And if you have any questions or areas you'd like to discuss, we'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, Louise. That was great. Yes, a lot of people have sat through that. That's great. I thought that was a very interesting overview of our surveys, and it does really ask some pretty big questions of us, which we're only beginning to explore. And so, if anybody does have any questions on that or any comments, that would be great. So, we have a question in our chat, Louise, from Caroline.
All right.
So Caroline's asking, in terms of the recognition level, the 24%, how do you think that compares to other regulators?
Oh, well, it's hard to compare because there aren't very many regulators that are as sort of young as us and have exactly the same role as us. So obviously the closest direct comparator is the Charity Commission for England and Wales. They've been going a lot longer than us. They're over 100. We're sort of been around since 2006, and awareness of them is just over 50%. So depending on how you ask the question and so on. So we do have less awareness than the Charity Commission for England and Wales, but considering their profile, recognition of the term Charity Commission, the fact that they've been around for so long, the fact that they get a lot of media coverage, and they're still just at 50%, I might have expected awareness throughout the UK to maybe of them to be a bit higher. So I don't actually think we're so bad. And I know we've wrestled with this in the past. Jude and I have spoken about, do the public really need to know who OSCR is, or is it mainly just about regulation, that general assumption that somebody is there and that charities are being held to account in a way?
Thank you, Louise. Yes, I mean, I think it's a very good reflection, because I think it's one of the challenges that we are giving ourselves over the next year, to really dig into that quite deeply and to think about, you know, what is the best way of doing that. We have some good tools that work already. The charity number, as Louise said in her presentation, is a really great tool that people are more and more recognising as they go out and about. And so we've got some hooks already. So what we're trying to wrestle with, what is the best and most effective way of raising profile for ourselves, but more than anything for charity regulation and for charities themselves. So yeah, I think that's a very good reflection. And Caroline says yes, it's 24% seems good for a young, small organisation. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Are there any other questions or reflections at all on any of that? I believe that support for local charities is higher in Scotland than in other UK nations. Thanks, Steve, for that. Any thoughts on why that might be?
There is, when we were overhauling the materials this year and discussing this with Breaking Blue, the supplier, we didn't really get to the bottom of why we thought that could be. And certainly I think market research like this is really limited in trying to get to grips with people's underlying sort of assumptions and motivations for why they might give scores like that. And we did mention, I know this is not the answer you'll be looking for, but we did mention there was something quite Scottish about that sort of thing. There is a sort of Scottish brand, a Scottishness, awareness and support for charities in your local organisation, and a sort of pride, I suppose, is what we felt might be at the bottom of it. But we don't know. I suppose more concerning is the sort of lower trust levels for charities working internationally, and whether it is that distance or sort of scepticism about what they're doing, or an inability to sort of check up what's going on or seeing that direct impact that might be behind it. But no, it's really interesting. And I think asking about that much broader range of organisations, trust in those, in a way it gives us more questions than answers, but I think it certainly puts it in context that it's not just international charities that have lower trust. There are other charities that maybe the public views less trustworthy. But you do have to caution it. The public are not always the most informed. Their assumptions are not always correct. And that's an important part of our role and other sort of support organisations in sort of building an accurate and well-informed view of what the Scottish charity sector is and what it does and how it works.
Yeah, I think that's a great reflection there, and I think it is quite complicated because there's a lot of different strands that are coming together there to make up that picture. And as Louise says, it's actually quite difficult sometimes to unearth, you know, what everything that's going on. I think one of the reflections that's quite interesting is if you look at the number of people that in one way or another are involved in charities, you know, so it's over 90%, a lot of them actually are involved in local charities, and that brings that level of trust. A lot of them are not. A lot of them are involved in you know, other charities. But there are sort of conflicting sometimes when you talk to particularly when you talk to the focus groups, which is a great way of, it doesn't give you, you know, testable findings. It helps you explore some of these ideas, and it's very useful for us to have these focus groups. But sometimes people will be very anti people fundraising in the street, but actually they're quite pro the cancer research, which is one of the hugest charities in Scotland, which will do fundraising in the street, but because they have a particular link to that. So separating all these things is quite tricky, but at least we've started to try and dig a little bit more deeply into that. And I certainly think, Louise, if I'm not wrong, we've got a little bit of a clearer picture this year from some of the questions we've asked, because we've tried to ask them in slightly different ways. So hopefully that will continue. Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Any other questions for Louise or any reflections? No, I'm going to finalise by, excellent presentation. There you go. I'm just going to finish by asking Louise, you know, from these surveys, if you could only take 2 new actions coming out of them, have you any sense of what you would want to concentrate on? She doesn't like that question.
I don't like that question. I would like to do some, I don't think it's maybe something to carry on doing market research on. I think I would like to corroborate some of these findings in sort of more detailed user-based research with members of the public, looking at how they interact with charities and with regulation, or a concept of accountability or regulation. Charities are not just accountable to OSCR, not just accountable for the sake of being regulated. They're accountable to their beneficiaries, they're accountable to their communities, they're accountable to their funders. And so looking at how members of the public might see that overall picture, I think is particularly interesting. And the presentation today focused on a very narrow sort of story within the research. We actually have a lot more detail, there's a lot more depth in the overall report that Breaking Blue provided to us. And we also have some detailed data tables which really interrogate in more detail how the public and how charities use things like the Scottish Charity Register, what they expect to see on it, how good that is at meeting their needs. And so I suppose corroborating things with more sort of in-depth user research is one area I'd like to look at. I'd also like to spend time looking at the register and some of the things we do that the public do have an appetite for, to see how we can sort of improve and understand those things and really sort of maximise our role in generating that good understanding of the sector.
Great. Okay, I think we'll probably draw it to a close there. I think that's been a great wee story told from our surveys. This will be up online, so you can tell anybody else who might be interested that they can go and have a look at that. And I just want to thank you all for coming and listening, and we are very pleased that we've been able to share these surveys with you. So thank you. Have a lovely afternoon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.